Kik Kennedy was an American socialite and the fourth of the numerous Kennedy children, one of the leading political dynasties in US history. She was the rebel of the family and would go on to become heir to Chatsworth after marrying William Cavendish, Marquess of Hartington. But her marriage and life were cut tragically short as part of the Kennedy curse. Join me to find out what happened. Kathleen Kennedy was born at 83 Beale Street in Brookline, Massachusetts on the 20th of February 1920. Her father was Joseph Kennedy Sr., while her mother was Rose Fitzgerald. She had three older siblings, Joseph Jr., Rosemary and John, better known to his family as Jack, while in due course 5 more Kennedy children were born in the 1920s and early 1930s. Eunice, Patricia, Robert, better known as Bobby, Jean and Edward the youngest, being known to history as Ted Kennedy. Kathleen was a flamboyant child, who was given the nickname Kik by her family during her early years, a name which would endure for the rest of her life. She was educated at Riverdale Country School in the Bronx in New York City, before attending different high schools in Connecticut and for a time a convent school in France. Growing up, she was a keen athlete and quite extroverted. She liked to play football with her older brothers, and her high spirits led to her gaining the attention of lots of Jack's friends. Kathleen had been born into a family which was already well established as a leading American business and political family. The Kennedys were Irish Americans who traced their roots back to the settling of the Kennedys in the US in the aftermath of the Irish potato famine of the late 1840s. Kathleen's grandfather, P.J. Kennedy, served in the Massachusetts state legislature in the mid-1880s. He was also a successful businessman, and his son Joseph Kennedy Sr., Kathleen's father, inherited a large fortune even before P.J. died in 1929. In the 1920s, while Kathleen was still a child, Joseph Kennedy expanded the Kennedy business interests, becoming a financier to the emerging Hollywood film studios, as they transitioned from silent movies to the talkies, the euphemistic name for films with dialogue. Kennedy also made a small fortune as a bootlegger of Scotch whiskey during the era of Prohibition between 1920 and 1933. As Kathleen grew up and the Kennedy fortune expanded hugely, her father began to acquire political ambitions, and these would see Kathleen develop an association with Britain which would characterize her adult life. In the first weeks of 1938, when Kathleen was still shy of her 18th birthday, her father was appointed as the US ambassador to the United Kingdom by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Shortly afterwards, Kathleen and the rest of her family set off across the Atlantic for Joseph to take up his position in London. It would be a controversial appointment, as Joseph was an American isolationist who believed the US should remain aloof from the growing conflict between Britain and France and Nazi Germany. Shortly after the Kennedys' arrival in London, Kathleen turned 18 and was introduced to high society at the debutante ball known as Queen Charlotte's Ball, a high society event held since the late 18th century. Such debutante balls were a common practice during the interwar period. Owing to the media attention foisted on Joseph Kennedy and his family shortly after their arrival in England, a lot of press focus was pointed towards Kathleen's appearance at the ball, and she was touted in the British newspapers as the debutante of 1938. When the Second World War broke out in the first days of September 1939, Kathleen was in France. She was quickly summoned back to Britain, as there were fears that the Germans would attempt an invasion of France in the late autumn of 1939, though this would not eventually occur until the early summer of 1940. Back in England, Joseph Kennedy's isolationist stance and his sympathies towards fascism became indefensible, especially so as President Roosevelt was in favour of providing covert aid to Britain against the Nazis. Consequently, he was withdrawn as ambassador, and in 1940 the Kennedys returned to America. There, Kathleen dated several young men for a time, though her relationships did not last long, in large part because she was moving around the country, attending the Finch School and undergraduate college in New York for a while, before heading south to Florida to take classes at the Commercial College in the Sunshine State. At the time, she began volunteering with the American Red Cross and eventually obtained a junior position with the Washington Times-Herald, a newspaper based out of the capital which she wrote cultural reviews for. Kathleen's decision to sign up for the Red Cross in the early 1940s was her way to contribute something towards the war effort in Europe. The Kennedy children, generally speaking, did not share their father's political views to any extent, and decades later, they became the antithesis in many respects of what Joseph Sr. believed. In the early 1940s, Kathleen and several of her siblings were in favour of US entry into the war on the side of Britain, and were happy when in December 1941, President Roosevelt ended US neutrality and entered the conflict against Germany and Japan following the attack on the US Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. As part of her work with the Red Cross, Kathleen returned to Britain early in 1943, serving in various hospitals and convalescent centres in England. It was during this time that she began a relationship with William Cavendish, the Marquess of Hartington, and the heir designate to Edward Cavendish, 10th Duke of Devonshire, and one of the most senior aristocrats in Britain. William was close in age to Kathleen, and they'd known each other since the late 1930s, during the Kennedys' time in Britain as the ambassadorial family to the country from the US. Now, they resumed their friendship, and eventually began dating each other. At a time when courtship was often a short affair, they quickly made plans to marry, and were wed on the 6th of May 1944. The relationship between the wider Cavendish and Kennedy families was tense, in large part because Kathleen's drift away from the Roman Catholic Church, which her family were avowed members of, was seen as partly owing to her ties to the Cavendishes. As a result, Kathleen and William were married in a register office on the King's Road in Chelsea in London. The only Kennedy member of the family to attend the ceremony was Kathleen's eldest brother Joseph, whom she had grown close to during these years. Sadly, their union would not last long. At the time of their marriage, William was serving in the 5th Battalion of the Coldstream Guards. Just weeks later, his unit was prominent in the D-Day landings in northern France, and William was sent to Europe to fight the Nazi threat. On the 9th of September 1944, as part of the drive to liberate the port city of Antwerp in Belgium, which the Allies needed to seize in order to bring in further reinforcements and material to Western Europe, William was shot by a Waffen SS sniper in the town of Heppen in Belgium. He died almost instantly. He was just 26 years of age, and he and Kathleen had only been married for 4 months. Kathleen was one of many young women who were widowed in the course of the Second World War, but her loss was especially cruel. William and she had only been married for 5 weeks when he had left for France, and she never saw him alive again. In the interim, her brother Joseph was also killed while on a flying mission over England in August 1944. Neither body was brought back to England for burial. Joseph's plane had exploded in such a fashion that it caused damage even on the ground below, and so his body was never found, while William was buried in Belgium, near where he was killed, at a time in the war when few bodies could be repatriated. Following her husband's death, Kathleen moved out of the order of succession to the Duchy of Devonshire. Had William lived, she would have become the Duchess someday, but with his death, and Kathleen and he not having had any children, the succession now passed to William's brother Andrew and his wife Deborah Cavendish, née Mitford. Kathleen retained the title of Lady Hartington following her husband's death. Kathleen soon recovered from her grief, and in the aftermath of the end of the war in May 1945, she began seeing Peter Wentworth Fitzwilliam, 8th Earl Fitzwilliam. This was a problematic relationship, as Fitzwilliam had been married to Olive Dorothea Plunket since 1933, and so Kathleen was entering an extramarital relationship when she began seeing Fitzwilliam. This perturbed her family, and her parents had indicated that she would be cut off financially from the Kennedy fortune if she continued on her present path. Kathleen persisted though, and by 1948, Fitzwilliam had agreed that he would leave his wife if Kathleen could get her family's approval of the union. Yet, the effort to do so would prove fatal for both of them. In the late spring of 1948, Kathleen and Lord Fitzwilliam decided to head to France for a trip which had 2 purposes. Firstly, they were taking a holiday. Secondly, Kathleen's father was due to be in Paris for a time early that summer, and they wanted to meet with him and gain his blessing for them to marry, as head of the Kennedy household. They were in the French capital by early May, and they decided to fly to the French Riviera. The private chartered plane that Kathleen and Peter were flying on left Paris at 3:30 on the afternoon of the 13th of May. It proceeded south on a normal flight trajectory, but around 4:30 PM, the plane entered stormy conditions in the skies above the town of Vienne in southeastern France. Radio contact with the ground was lost shortly afterwards. Severe turbulence followed over the next 20 or so minutes, eventually ripping one of the plane's wings off. As the plane plummeted downwards, the engine and fuselage were compromised, and the plane eventually crashed into a ravine near Saint-Beaucile, about midway between Lyon and the southern French coast. Kathleen, Peter and the pilot and navigator were all killed in the crash. Their remains were recovered, and Kathleen was subsequently buried at her late husband's family burial plot at Chatsworth House in northern England. The rift between Kathleen and her family was severe, owing to her rebellious nature and her complicated love life, and only her father showed up to represent the Kennedys at the funeral. Kathleen's premature death in 1948 was just one of the first incidents in what has become known as the Kennedy curse. As we saw earlier, less than 4 years before her own passing, her older brother Joseph Jr. had also been killed in an air accident when the bomber plane he was flying during the Second World War malfunctioned over Suffolk in August 1944 and exploded. Just a few years before this, another of their siblings, Rosemary, had been lobotomized, at a time when lobotomies were still experimental and believed to be effective against mental health issues. And the Kennedy curse did not end with Kathleen. 15 years later, her brother John, better known to the world as JFK, was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, followed by her other brother Bobby in 1968. Since then, the Kennedy curse has claimed many other relatives to accidental deaths, plane crashes, and drug overdoses, making one of America's most notable families, also one of its most tragic. Thank you everyone for watching this video on Kathleen Kennedy. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments. This was suggested, so if you have any other suggestions, also be sure to leave them down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.